In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how procedural terrains are created and create a canyon terrain. Alright, so a few lessons ago we had talked about procedural terrains and how they are created, and that they're created mathematically. So let's take a look at what that looks like exactly. Now, we talked about those procedural terrains and how they could be touched up, but they couldn't necessarily be painted because of those mathematical algorithms in which they're created. So let's right-click on our procedural terrain, and let's just choose a regular procedural terrain here. I'm going to hit OK and apply that in there. And what I want to do at this point is go ahead and open up the terrain editor, and we can begin to choose whatever different mountains we want, or we can choose peaks, whatever we want to do at this point. But what I want to focus on is the procedural panel here. Now you'll notice that we have very limited options here. There's not a whole lot going on. Now we have this altitude production, and this entire altitude, this entire mountain, is being created based on this material. Now if I click on my mountain again, you'll see how that material changes. Okay, so we could also change the material or change this mountain by clicking on randomize, and we're going to get the same effect there. Alright, now let's go ahead and right click on this material and go to edit function. Now this mountain is created from this function here. We have a position node which feeds into a vector3 seed, and we have a multiply by constant number, and then it outputs this material. Okay, it's a sample fractal, and then it outputs it out as an altitude. Now let's double click on this material, and this is going to go outside of our capture area. Let's go ahead and drag this up the best that we can here. And you'll see that we have these fractal node options here. Now right now this is a simple fractal, and we could change this to a grainy fractal and get a different result altogether. We could do rocky mountains, we could do eroded rocky mountains, that sort of thing. Let's hit OK and see what kind of effect we get here. So you can see how that's changed the procedural material here, or the procedural terrain. Let's right click and go to edit function again. Let's double click, or just click on that eroded rocky material. Let's bring this back up so we can see what we're looking at. And I'm just going to change this back to that simple fractal. Alright, now what we have here are several base settings that we can choose from. And we can begin to come in here and just adjust these sliders and get a different result altogether. Now you can come in and you can experiment with these however you feel. You can use several different noise patterns to change this up. So if we want to set it to chipped, we could do so. If we hit OK on this, you'll see how that looks. Just totally different. And this is the way that we're going to be able to sculpt with procedural terrains. We can't really do a whole lot of hands-on painting and that sort of thing. Now, like we said, procedural terrains take a lot of time to work with, and that's because we're doing it all mathematically using the function editor. Now this can be a really neat experience trying to create all kinds of different terrains, and the result is magnificent. So we're not really going to get into the full expanse of the edit function, or the function editor, but we will kind of start to look at some of those major options that we can begin to experiment with. So right click, go to that edit function again, and we're just going to be spending our time with messing with this actual material here. Okay, so we have a cellular pattern, we have it set to chipped. We could choose any one of these if we really wanted to. The Voronoi, okay, we have this different pattern here. There are several different ones that you can choose from. Granite is there. We have flat patterns, we have watercress, varying blocks, that sort of thing. So you can just see how great this is going to be for you. Now I can't remember where we were at with our default, but we should be okay. We'll just leave it just the way it is for now. Now we can turn on with rotation or without, okay, and that's going to just simply rotate that along our terrain. We can set up a wavelength, so if we adjust our wavelength in our X direction, you'll see how that begins to stretch in the X direction. So if I set that to 4, set my Y to 4 as well, and you can see how that begins to stretch there. Let's hit OK and see what that looks like in here. So you can see that we get kind of this blockiness in here. And you can create a very interesting sort of terrain, and this just looks almost unnatural. And this would be a neat little terrain for like a some sort of Martian planet or something like that. So there are just endless possibilities that you can go through just by editing those functions and experimenting with some of those different ones. Now this is without a material, but again, this is just really neat to work with. Let's go ahead and face our sun here. Bring that in. Do a quick render on that just to see what that looks like. And just overall, just a neat little material. Now we've changed the shape of this, and again, whenever we zoom in on this and we render it out, we're still going to get that high level of detail because this is still a procedural terrain. Let's double click on this and go back to our material and right click and edit function. And you can continue to work with these different options here. We have origin, which is going to basically rely on that wavelength. So if I change my origin to 5 and 5, you'll notice that it's not really doing anything to my material, but it will adjust how it looks in the material editor here. So if I go to 3, you can kind of see how that's changing there. And let's hit OK. And you're going to see that you're going to get just a slightly different pattern here. And let's right click, edit function on that. And let's set that back to 1 and 1. And we'll set the origin back to 0 and 0. Alright, now again, you can continue to work with some of these different options, and we're not going to be really have time to go through all of these, but again, this is just a great place to begin experimenting with the function editor. Now let's go ahead and cancel this, and let's double click on our actual material, and you can see that we can select a function, and we have several different collections to choose from. We could do a grainy fractal, which is very familiar. That's one that we saw earlier. So if we chose that, you'll see that this is what we get. Let's double click on that again, and let's choose something a little bit different. Let's go to this drought. And you can see that you can get this material or this altitude on your terrain. Now you can adjust the scale of this, so if I take my scale down, you'll see how that scales down on my terrain here. Let's adjust this up a little bit higher and make that come together a little bit closer. Okay. Now let's double click on this. Let's choose something a little bit different. Let's go down to fractals here. We can choose any number of these materials here and get a different result. We can do ultra sharp, and you can see how this just changes our altitude here. Let's double click on this and actually use a terrain altitude. And these are a set of presets that we can use to create different types of materials or different types of terrains. So you'll see we have an alien desert, alien mounds, and here is our canyon. So let's hit OK on this, and you'll see that this is the canyon we're going to get. Now let's go ahead and randomize this, and let's continue to randomize through this until we get a good look here. Let's turn on or turn off that zero edges there. So randomize this. We'll begin to get all of these different materials here, or different variations of our canyon. Alright, so this is one that's pretty interesting. We're going to hit OK on this. And let's come around in here and let's get a good angle on this. I just kind of want to create a little bit of a composition here just to make this look a little more interesting. And let's hit OK on that. You can see how this creates those altitudes. Now, it does not create those lines across the middle. That's one thing that we need to understand about procedural terrains, is that it's only going to raise the terrain straight up in an altitude. Now, if we want things like the lines going across the middle of our terrains, we're going to do that with materials. Okay, so anything that's going to be pushed into the actual terrain itself is going to be controlled by materials. Alright, so that's a quick look at how we can edit procedural materials. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at procedural materials again, but we're going to be using that touch-up method to create an overall look in a more artistic way. Alright, so we'll see you in the next lesson.